Greetings fellow Mist Wanderers, my name is Steve Morgan and this is DM of the Mists, covering all things Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft. I've covered off a few Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft NPCs at this point. I did a video about Ezmerelda Davenier and other wider Ravenloft NPCs who don't appear in Curse of Strahd, such as Franz Alhonen, Jander Sunstar and the weathermay-foxgrove twins. I had a few requests from people if I could cover the main man himself, and I'm not talking about Strahd. I am of course talking about Dr Rudolph van Richten, who, if you've seen my earlier videos, I used to pronounce Van Richten. That's kind of a carryover from an old DM I had who DM'd Curse of Strahd for me. That's how he thought it was pronounced, so that's how I thought it was pronounced. And since then, obviously with Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft coming out and YouTube videos about that, the Strahd audiobooks, I realised it was actually more like Van Richten. I stuck with my old habit and pronounced it wrong, but then realised I should just train myself to say it the correct way, so I now say Van Richten. Although I've since discovered that it might actually be Van Richten? Could be something like that. So is it Richten? That sounds like a really terrible dance song. Anyway, in my day job, I work in online marketing and specifically in what's called search engine optimization. And some research tells me that a lot of people look up Van Richten on places like Google and YouTube. So if you've discovered me and this is the first video of mine you've seen, hello, welcome to the channel. I cover just Curse of Strahd and just Ravenloft, kind of 50-50. Please check out my old videos. I've got a couple of playlists, and please subscribe if you haven't already or if you're new to the channel. Part of that research, I also looked up what other videos were appearing for when you type in Van Richten, and a lot of sort of lore videos like I'm doing, but they're only about 5-10 minutes. Mine is probably going to be a little bit longer. We're going to go deep, folks. I tend to have a habit of covering a lot. The Ezmerelda video was half an hour if I remember correctly, but I'm going to cover sources of information for him, how to roleplay him in both his guises, which we'll obviously talk about later, how to handle him as an ally and how to handle him if he's not the fated ally, his controversy around his tiger, combat tips, how things went down in my Curse of Strahd campaign, including one time when he was on trial with a Vistani and I had to improvise and run a Vistani trial. That was fun. And what happened to him in my current post-Curse of Strahd wider Ravenloft domain hopping campaign, where he died. That's right, folks. Van Richten died in my campaign. And since then I realised I can actually legitimately bring him back. And before I move on much further, if you are a player in an active Curse of Strahd or Ravenloft game, this is a video that's for DMs. It tells DMs how to run Van Richten, information about Van Richten. Please don't watch any further. There's going to be a huge spoiler coming up soon, and I'm sure your DM won't like it if you know that. I know there's some players who get so excited with D&D, they like to research characters in their own time, but please, you don't want to spoil that for yourself. You don't want to spoil it for your DM. So if you are a player and not a DM, please click off now. Sources of information, well, the obvious one or two are Curse of Strahd and Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. Curse of Strahd has his stat block where, and this is the big spoiler, it's not Van Richten, it's Rictavio, which is the disguise he uses while he's in Valachan. You can find information for him not only in his stat block and his appendix section, but also in various Valachan sections, notably the inn and the stockyard where he keeps his wagon, in the Van Richten's Tower chapter for obvious reasons, and there's a small bit of info in Ezmerelda's appendix as well, and there's probably a few other bits and bobs littered around, but those are the ones that jump out from memory. He also has a journal excerpt as a handout. A really cool bit of flavour I think I saw from people is that the Lich who gives him the zombies in that journal entry could be Azalin Rex. It makes sense, it's Darkon, and Azalin, at least in old lore, it's a bit more complicated in 5th edition, but at least in old lore, Azalin was the Darklord of Darkon. So he just sees this Lich in the woods, it's probably Azalin. That is really cool. And then when it comes to Van Richten's guide, it has more info for him in the Mist Wanderers section. In the first chapter, I think, or the introduction, there's some letters, some from his protégés to him and one from him to his protégés, and that can give you a bit more information and flavour as well. The Strahd novels, primarily told from Strahd's perspective, and Strahd doesn't interact with Van Richten at all. However, the prologue and epilogues star him heavily. In the prologues and epilogues of the first Strahd novel, Memoirs of a Vampire, he is exploring Castle Ravenloft, and he discovers essentially the Tome of Strahd. He finds Strahd's journal. And in the prologue and epilogue of Strahd, the War Against Azalin, it's set in Mordant, in the town Mordantshire, and he is in a bookshop and discovers another book, another diary of Strahd's, if you will. I don't feel like these are essential reading unless, or at least not for Van Richten. I think they're probably essential reading, especially the first one for Strahd. If you're, say, running a game where you have, say, a wider Ravenloft game, you're not doing Curse of Strahd and Van Richten's going to appear in it, but Strahd isn't, for example, then it's probably not worth getting 2 books just to read the intro and outro of them. They give you good flavour and a good feel for what he's like, but, you know, I wouldn't say they're essentially essential. I remember one thing in Curse of Strahd saying that he's not a very sociable person, he works alone. What's interesting is in the prologue of the second Strahd novel, he's very sociable to the bookshop owner and very friendly, very polite, very noble-like. He is a scholar after all. So, you know, it gives you an idea of kind of his dialogue and how he talks to people and people he likes and respects, I guess. It might be something you want to channel into your game and the way he speaks to your PCs, perhaps. What I like about them as well is they give you good lines you can drop. My absolute favourite, at the end of the prologue for the first one, when he finds the term Strahd, essentially, the line is something like, "By all the good gods, a personal journal?" So I loved "By all the good gods." That was, in my game, that was the equivalent of, oh my god. If he said he was shocked or surprised by something, he would just say, "By all the good gods, what's going on?" kind of thing. And another one, I was going to say reread, I've got the audiobooks, so I re-listened to both of them before doing this video. And another one he says, or I don't think he actually says it, I think it's more like his perspective in the narration. I think he panics and he needs to get out of the castle, and it's something like, "Blessed powers, I need to get out of here," or something. And I like that, "blessed powers," like another sort of equivalent, oh my god kind of thing. Misterpedia on the Fraternity of Shadows website is a wiki of all the old lore. It has got some new lore stuff. I think it has actually got an article on Rictavio / Van Richten, but it's great for if you want to see what the old lore was like about him. There's a great section, if you want, where there's a category, there's a dedicated category called Foes of Van Richten, and there's a lot of pages in there. He had a lot of foes, has, delete is appropriate. But if you want a flavour of kinds of the monsters he's fought and enemies he's fought in the past, go on there, have a flick through. There's liches, there's mummies, there's werewolves, there's vampires. It's great, and there's a lot of them as well. This man has killed a lot of monsters and a lot of difficult monsters as well. There's a great post by a Reddit user called Guild's Bounty. I think I mentioned him in a recent video. It was my tips video, Tips of Curse of Strahd, where he does a great write-up for Strahd as well. But he also does a great write-up for Van Richten and a few other NPCs. It's quite long, but it's worth the read. A few highlights I like are that the author explains how parents tell their children, you know, you must go to sleep, otherwise, you know, there could be monsters. You know, set the sort of scary bedtime story as well. Monsters, put in their monster children to sleep, get told stories of the evil Van Richten who will come after them if they don't behave and stuff like that. And I just thought that was really cool flavour. You know, monsters are scared of him. He's got that kind of reputation. One line I liked was, "Mix together a Witcher and Batman, then pack it into a really old guy." And that kind of sums up Van Richten. And in regards to his Rictavio disguise, sometimes the best disguise is being the most obvious thing in the room. And when I get to role-playing him, that comes really true when it comes to sort of, you know, you've got the kind of the stark difference between the two personalities, if you will. MandyMod is another Reddit user who's been very generous with their time writing guides. Also includes some information about Van Richten, but she confesses that she borrowed a lot from Guild's Bounty. If you read hers and you read Guild's Bounty, you'll probably see that they're quite similar, but it might be worth checking out her stuff as well. And then Dragna Carter, author of Curse of Strahd Reloaded, he has some information on Van Richten as well. I read both the old version. He's currently, as I record this, still working on a sort of version 2, a reloaded. And I read both versions of his take on Van Richten, and that's worth a look as well, especially if you're running Reloaded or Reloaded. Let's talk about role-playing Van Richten / Rictavio. I had a lot of fun. I'll get to later what happened in my campaign, but he was drawn as a fated ally. So I felt like I had to do Van Richten / Rictavio justice, and I knew my players would likely to be spending a lot of time with him. And for Rictavio, his disguise, the half-elf bard, and especially inspired by that Guild's Bounty thing about being the most obvious thing in the room, well, I played him as loud, eccentric, and very sociable and very friendly. And I think I gave him a voice like this. "Hello, friends. Welcome to Valachan, and welcome to the Blue Water Inn. My name is Rictavio, and I will regale you with tales of monsters, things that go bump in the night," and that kind of thing. It was really good fun kind of playing this just really over the top carnival ringmaster kind of character. Now later on, when they went to Van Richten's tower, or Kazan's tower as it's kind of, it should actually be known as, but it's Van Richten's tower in the story and in the Curse of Strahd book, they found him at the tower, and instead of finding Rictavio, they found this old man and I played Van Richten as a lot more brooding, a lot more moody. Just complete stark opposite to Rictavio. So Rictavio, the sort of loud and some might consider a bit over the top and obnoxious circus man. And then you've got the brooding Van Richten, tired old man who's killed a vampire or 2 or 3 or 10 in his time. That kind of thing, that kind of voice and attitude. I guess maybe, especially when I said about Strahd just now, with Strahd, he comes across as a bit friendlier, but this is kind of getting towards the end of his life and he's jaded. He's been doing this a long time. He's a lot more brooding and serious. Maybe when he talks about monsters, he kind of perks up and a bit of Rictavio creeps in, and when he's telling the PCs, when you fight a werewolf, you need to be aware of this, this and this, and he's, gets a bit more, I don't want to say excitable, but you know what I mean? He kind of, he's less sort of brooding, not broody, brooding and moody. But yes, that was the way that I kind of approached him. The good thing about Van Richten is if you plan to extend Curse of Strahd into other domains of dread, well, he's from one and he lives in another. So you can, when they first arrive into Barovia, they'll eventually learn about Barovia being a domain of dread, and they might learn about what is domains of dread. And then he can introduce Darkon, which is where he's from, and Mordant, where obviously when he's not living in Barovia, because that's where he is now, but when he's not living in Barovia, that's his home at the moment. And that was great for me because I'm running a wider post-Curse of Strahd game now, and they've been to Mordant, and at one time they'll go to Darkon, and they know about those places already. One thing I understand about Van Richten as well is, Strahd, I played him as Strahd being his one big final score before retirement, or at least retirement from monster hunting. This is his last monster he's going to fight before he then settles down in Mordant in his shop. So he's an old man, he's been doing this a long time, but this is it. This is the big bad, probably the strongest, scariest, most deadliest monster he's going to fight, and he's going to take down Strahd or die trying. An interesting aspect as well is Ezmerelda. Ezmerelda is one of his protégés. I found it quite fun role-playing the relationship between Ezmerelda and Rictavio / Van Richten. Ezmerelda I played is quite lively, quite friendly, quite bubbly, but also quite serious. She's got that sort of aspect from Van Richten of being, when it comes down to business and fighting monsters, she's not messing around kind of thing. But between them, when you pair them together, and I know there's stuff in the book saying about how they spent some time together, they kind of fell out. That's great, and I think as well as maybe Van Richten's appendix, I think it's more in Ez's appendix, but you know that when they come back together, those squabbles and those arguments and that sort of ugly side of their relationship comes back again. And one thing I noticed as well is if you look at the alignments, Rictavio Van Richten is lawful good and Ez is chaotic good. And you can kind of play them with that in mind. Van Richten is very careful. He's plotting, he's scheming. He's like, what can I do to kill this vampire in the easiest, most risk-free way possible? Whereas Ezmerelda's just charged in already while he's been thinking about it. That kind of thing. So I played them as like, they'd have arguments about how to tackle this thing. Like, if they're going to go to the werewolf den or... Because what happened in my game as well is Van Richten was the fated ally, but Ez did join them for a little bit at times. So say if they went to the werewolf den together, Ez is like, let's just go in, guns blazing, and Van Richten's like, no, you must be more careful. No, that's not the way to approach it. And, and then I wouldn't role play arguments between them because that'd be a bit weird. It'd be like me arguing with myself because I'm playing both characters, but I might say, they might say certain things and I'll just say out of character to the PCs. And this goes on for some time. They're just basically the two of them just arguing with each other, and the PCs are like, okay, guys. Let's talk next about if he's the ally. Or no, more if he becomes the ally to the PCs, regardless of whether he is or isn't the fated ally or Strahd's enemy, more officially, as per the tarokka reading. I'm going to cover both aspects. So if he's not the fated ally or if he is the fated ally, different things can happen. If he's not the fated ally, well, because of his curse, and that's detailed in the information for him in the book, he will refuse to travel with the players. He believes this Vistani curse that anyone he travels with will die. And, maybe not straight away, but eventually he just draws danger to him. And I like interpreting the curse in one of two ways. One is that it is an actual curse. He's actually cursed, and that's true. That's what happens. He spends time with people and they die. Maybe that's why he distances himself from Ezmerelda, potentially. Or he's not cursed at all, but he's in the business of hunting monsters. Of course people are going to die. It's not going to be the case that everywhere he goes with people that everyone survives all the time. People are going to die in his presence because he's got a very dangerous job. But that kind of feeds, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy that he thinks he's cursed because people are dying around him, but he could be, he's not cursed at all. I mean, obviously he's got access to the spell remove curse. He probably would have cast it on himself, although maybe he thinks it's a special curse, a bit like Strahd's Curse. That's the name of the book. Strahd's Curse, where obviously you cast Remove Curse on a vampire, and he's not suddenly like, oh, I'm no longer a vampire. He's still a vampire. It doesn't work like that. And so if that's the case, if he refuses to travel with the players, he would act as an advisor from his base, Van Richten's tower, if he's at that point where he's already been shooed out of, what's the phrase? Is it bailed out of Dodge? If he's already left Valachan by that point, and he'll be in Van Richten's tower, then he knows it's a safe place that the PCs can retreat to, they can rest up in, because it's difficult to gain access to. It's got the anti-magic field around it, it's safe from scrying and things like that. They know they can go there and he can give them more advice and he can rest up and stuff. However, if he is the fated ally, I treated it differently because I don't think it's very fair. And there are some DMs who would say that you can interpret the fated ally aspect in various ways, and so long as they kind of, I think at the bare minimum, the person would only join the PCs in the final battle, the final confrontation against Strahd. They don't necessarily have to travel around with them all the time. But I thought my players didn't really have many healers, and he's a great healing character, which I'll get to when I talk about his stat block. So I had him travel around, curse be damned. He said to them something like, oh, you know, I've got this curse, just to warn you, people will die around me. I seem to attract death and misery, blah, blah, blah. Do you still want me to travel around with you? And they were like, well, yes, we do. So I ultimately gave the players agency and let them have the decision. They could have said no, but they ultimately, of course, are going to say yes because of how cool he is and how useful he is, and because of the tarokka reading said so, and things like that. I play this a little bit different to Guild's Bounty. In Guild's Bounty, he says, even if he finds out that he's the fated ally, he's not just going to drop everything and be like, okay, I'm with you guys. I did do that because I kind of, whoever the fated ally was going to be, there's some Vistani magic in play, and it's almost like that person, whether they realize it or not, whether they know it or not, is drawn to the PCs. And when they first met Rictavio in Valachan, he kind of gave them a double take and was like, aha, there's something about you folks. Maybe we'll end up working together one day. And I actually had a bard PC, and because he's a Carnal Ringmaster, the bard just assumed, oh, we're going to like form a band or something. But no, he meant, you know, maybe I'm going to travel around with you and defeat Strahd together. And when it was revealed, and when they explained that it was Vistani magic, and I think this is hinted at in the book, he accepts his fate. He knows full well how powerful Vistani magic can be, hence, you know, through his curse. So of course, if these PCs say, Madam Eva says you've got to travel around with us, he's going to say, okay, it's fate, I'll help you. Maybe it's, well, there's a slight inkling in the back of Van Richten's mind that maybe he can't defeat Strahd on his own. His tactic of sneaking into the castle and staking Strahd in his coffin, maybe he thinks that's not going to be enough. Maybe I do need some powerful allies to help take him down, and they can help me and I can help them. And one thing I did as well is he said to them, listen, you know I'm Van Richten now. Strahd and other people will likely be after me. I'm going to continue travelling around as Rictavio. And so he would still be like this and, hello, and all that. And even though they knew deep down that was all just a disguise and not really who he was. Even to the point where it was like saying, don't even address me as Van Richten. As far as you're concerned, my name is, was, and will always be Rictavio. Please refer to me as Rictavio. To the point where I even forgot at times he was Van Richten, because I would be like saying, Rictavio does this and Rictavio says that. And my players were the same then as well. They just kind of referred to him more as Rictavio than Van Richten, which was kind of a safe, cool way to play it, I guess. Regardless of whether he's the fated ally or not the fated ally, a few things you might want to bear in mind are he can change his spells. I haven't had a deep dive into the new 2024 rules of 5th edition yet. I'm still going with the original 2014 rules. But my understanding is, and I know NPCs kind of follow different rules to PCs anyway, but if you want to kind of compare it to like a cleric PC, because he can cast cleric spells, he can change his spells on a long rest. And I actually swapped out his 5th level spell, the spell Evil and Good, for Greater Restoration, because I just thought that was a bit more useful. One thing to bear in mind is if, say, the players arrive and one of them needs Remove Curse, Greater Restoration, or Cure Wounds, don't forget that he can't cast that within the tower because of the spell drain, anti-magic field, whatever it's called. So you'd have to actually wander, it's a bit weird, you'd have to go down the lift, wander outside, heal them, or whatever, and then go back in. He's obviously got his loot in his wagons, he's got additional stuff there he could give to the players, or keep himself if he's travelling around with them. And there's some cool reveals you could do otherwise, like, one idea I had was if my players didn't have Rictavio as the fated ally. If, say, the Feast of St. Andros happens, if he's still around at that point and hasn't been scared away, although I guess Tiger might have happened and that might have scared him away, you could have a cool thing where, you know, the vampires spawn are loose in the town and causing havoc. And then this carnival ringmaster, say if the PCs are struggling, this carnival ringmaster steps out. They're like, oh, what's Rictavio going to do? He's just a half-elf bard. And then he's beating up these vampire spawn with some of his abilities, as we'll talk about in his stat block. And they'll be like, whoa, wasn't expecting that from him. And the fact that there's loads of clues that they might realise there's something not right about Rictavio. The fact that he's got cleric spells, not bard spells, is a bit unusual. The fact that he's got all this loot in his wagon that looks like it's all monster hunting stuff is a bit peculiar. The fact that if any of them use things like detect thoughts on him, it doesn't work because of his ring of mind shielding. I'll talk more about that when I get to his stat block in a minute. All this kinds of stuff is just really cool for making them think, this guy, there's something more to this guy. Next up, I want to address the controversy about his tiger. Now, because he trained his tiger to fight Vistani, and because he has a history of, through his journal excerpt and through his write-up, the Vistani are responsible for the death of his teenage son Erasmus, a lot of people interpret his dislike for the Vistani as racism, which it does come across very heavily as that. For that reason, there's a lot of DMs who just omit that. He has a tiger, but it doesn't hunt the Vistani, especially because the Vistani are based on real-life people. Some people would say that's true, some people wouldn't say that's true, but they draw parallels to a group of real-life people is probably the more accurate way to put it. So I can understand if people want to cut it out. Racism is horrible anyway. I approached it differently, and I want to stress it's not me making light of it. For what it's worth, I played in a TTRPG before getting into D&D where there are a couple of different races, and one race of people is supposed to be horrifically racist to another race of people, and I actually had to role play. I was the GM, I should explain. I had to role play a racist NPC towards a PC, and it was horrible. I was like, I'm not comfortable doing that. So I can completely understand. I just want people to know that racism is a horrible thing. And if you don't want it in your game, full stop, that's fine. I wrote like a mini essay and put it on Reddit. The whole Tiger Vistani thing, I interpret it differently. Feel free to use it in your game. I felt like it worked better and was a bit more, how to put it, not more comfortable, but, well, I'll just go ahead and explain it. My interpretation of it is he's not racist. He's not racist towards the Vistani. He is so far down the monster hunting rabbit hole, because he's been doing it for decades, hunting monsters, that he's forgotten to distinguish monsters and people as two different things. He has been researching Strahd. We know that because in the book it says he spent ages researching Strahd, committed it to memory, burnt all his notes in Van Richten's tower. Imagine he's in his head thinking, right, Strahd is a vampire. Who are Strahd's allies? Well, he's got probably vampire spawn. He's got wolves. He's got werewolves. He's got the Vistani, the druids and the berserkers, and so on and so on. And then you realise, obviously the druids and berserkers are people as well, but the Vistani are not monsters. They're not all evil people. I mean, heck, some of them are children, old people, that kind of thing. But it's almost as if he's just kind of closed off in his mind that they are people and there are innocent people there, and that he's just lumped them all in with the rest of the monsters. And so that's why he's trained his tiger to fight them, because he's just thinking, oh, that'll just take out a bunch of my enemies. That's one less thing to worry about. That'll weaken Strahd a bit. I'm glad I went with this approach and didn't cut it out entirely, because we had an amazing moment, and I'll talk about it later, and I did talk about it in another video, where it led to a Vistani trial. Basically, when my PCs found out, they turned him into the Vistani, and then he was put on trial. And that was incredible. It was one of my favourite moments of the campaign. I think it was one of the most memorable moments for my players as well. And if I'd omitted all of the Tiger Vistani stuff, that would never have happened. So I'm not saying, oh, you definitely need to include it. And I completely understand if you don't want to include it. But bear in mind, if you take it out, it might remove other potentially interesting elements that could crop up in your game as a result. If you want to read that sort of essay, which probably does a better job and is a bit longer than what I've described in this video, I'll include a link in the description. Let's talk about combat. He's got a very interesting and unique stat block. First thing that jumps to mind when you look at it is it's pretty weak. Yes, he does have a fair bit of HP, but his AC is really low. He's got an armor class of 12, wearing leather armor. And his attacks are pretty weak as well. His hit bonus is low, and his damage is low, despite the fact that he can attack twice, and despite the fact that he's got a silvered short sword. He's not a frontline fighter. He's got other ways of being useful. This is bearing in mind as well as if he's traveling around with the players, or if something happens in Valachan, I guess. But if you're playing him as he's only ever in the tower, you might not be playing him as actively as I'm describing, but, might still be worth bearing all this in mind. That said, he does have, we're talking about him not being a frontline fighter, he does have a really cool ability called Undead Slayer, where if he attacks somebody who's undead, he can do more damage to them. And I flavoured this as almost like he's hitting a weak spot. So he's got his cane, a zombie approaches him, and if he hits, he does the extra damage, which I flavoured as kind of like, you know, he hits exactly at the weak spot or the right place that does a lot of damage to that undead creature, whether it's a zombie, skeleton, vampire, or vampire spawn or something else. His sword cane reveal was great as well. The first time he used it in the campaign when he was travelling around with players, one of the first battles he had with them. Obviously he'd use his cane most of the time, but if it was something that was like a werewolf or something that he knew wouldn't have been effective where he just bops them with his cane, I had him where he goes and unsheaths it, and my players were like, whoa, what's he doing, what's he got? And he said he reveals his sword. Actually he tells him it's silvered as well. My players loved that. They just thought that was really cool. So the fact of the matter is, he's not going to really do melee attacks unless it's somebody who's undead, a werewolf, or he's desperate. Maybe he's on his own, maybe the rest of the players are knocked out all week. And even with the undead and werewolf, he's going to let the PCs probably do the brunt of the damage, but if they're running low on spells, or they're struggling, that's when he would swoop in and hopefully try and take them down. Given that he has access to his wagon contents, he's got a crossbow and silvered crossbow bolts in there. So I added to his stat block the crossbow and crossbow bolts. I even had him, he made a deal with one of the PCs where he shared some of his silvered crossbows. I think he did a trade where they both had some regular crossbow bolts and some silvered crossbow bolts. So he's not just wasting silver crossbow bolts on creatures where it doesn't make a difference. He's got access to both, and then a PC's got access to both as well, kind of a sort of mutually beneficial relationship there. But ultimately, he's more of a support person. He's got a lot of very support-like cleric spells, healing spells, spells that remove curses and illnesses and disease or conditions, I should say, things like that. He's got Death Ward, which you could potentially cast on Irene, or if Irene's around and it helps her, it means less likely she's going to get killed. Things like that. He's got access to items and magic items. There's some in his wagon, as I mentioned. There's some in his stat block. The Ring of Mind Shielding, very easy thing to forget about and overlook, but it's pretty important. His Hat of Disguise, as we all know. He's got a Scroll of Raised Dead. That's going to be incredibly handy in the Domains of Dread. And of course, all the stuff in his wagon, which I believe is in the Arisek's Dockyard section of Vallaki, detailed there. Ultimately, and I talk about this in the Ezmerelda video, his greatest strength is his knowledge of monsters. He is a walking monster manual, no check necessary. I think with Ezmerelda and the Weathermay-Foxgrove twins, I said they might need to roll an intelligence or history check. 15 and above, they know what it is. 20 and above, they know its weaknesses. No roll needed for Van Richten. He can just basically, or Rictavio, I should say, he could be like, ah, yes, this is a... I'm drawing a blank on what monsters there are in Barovia. This is a ghoul. Watch out for its claws. It could paralyze you, or whatever it is. You know, he could just tell them, oh, this enemy is weak against this type of damage, or, you know, these types of attacks aren't effective. And you as the DM can communicate to the players through him on his turn, shouting out instructions and directions and advice during his turn in combat. Some cool Guild's Bounty suggestions I read were, Van Richten used to be a doctor. Or, well, still is a doctor, you know what I mean? And sort of his pre-vampire hunting life, he was a doctor. And, you know, it makes sense to give him the healer feat, which means that if he uses a healer's kit on somebody, it restores HP. That's a good idea. And turn undead as well seems like a given. You could consider giving him that as well. Let's talk about how things played out in my game. I'm going to be as succinct as possible. And I'm probably just going to talk mostly about the setup of when he met them and stuff that happened afterwards. Not so much you know, they went to this place and this happened, they went to this place and this happened, you know, or this battle. I'm not going to give you a rundown of every battle, every session, every moment, but just kind of how they met him, and then ultimately what happened during the events of Curse of Strahd at a high level, and then what happened after. So as I mentioned earlier, the tarokka reading, he was drawn as the ally. I did a random-ish drawing, which meant that I did it random, but I took some cards out, so I didn't do it true to the book. And so I took out a few ally choices, actually, because there were a few allies I wasn't too fussed on. So instead of drawing, I think, his 14 cards, maybe there were 10, and he got drawn as the ally. And there's that clue, it says a man with a monkey, and I'm sure it happens with a lot of groups who draw Van Richten, Rictavio as the ally. They thought it was Blinsky. And my players love Blinsky as well, so they were like thinking he was a secret monster hunter, pretending to be a toy maker, which was pretty funny. As I mentioned earlier, when he finally saw them in Vallaki, he sensed something about them and kept an eye on them and was curious about them because of the Vistani tarokka magic in play. They, not long after arriving in Vallaki, they were exploring, found his wagon, which stood out like a sore thumb, and knew that there was something in there. They were very tempted to look inside, And then when they approached Rictavio about it, he said, listen, nobody knows I've got that except for you guys. And I think maybe the Arisex, the people who run the general store, please don't tell anyone. In return for keeping this a secret, I'll be your eyes and ears in Vallaki and help you any way I can. And they agreed to that. Unfortunately, one of my players forgot about this arrangement and then started talking about the tiger in the middle of the Blue Water Inn. Now, because it was a player mistake and not a PC mistake, I thought at first the PC's quite chaotic, a player, and it was very in character for him to just blab about this kind of thing and just kind of gossip and tell stories and stuff. So when in the middle of it happening, one of the other players was like, we're not supposed to be saying this. And the player was like, oh no. And I allowed him a retcon. I said, listen, your PC would remember this. You as a player had forgotten, to be fair, being probably a few weeks out of game, but probably only been, a few hours in game. And I said, listen, we can retcon this because your PC would know even if you didn't. So if you want, we'll say that none of this happened. And he goes, to be honest with you, my PC's the kind of person who likes to gossip and blab and probably would accidentally let slip. So I was like, fine, I gave you an out. You've not taken it. In game, you have just told people in the Blue Water Inn that Rictavio has a pet tiger. Not long after that, when they were talking to Blinsky and they kind of teased about the tarokka reading and said something about, we're supposed to be looking for a person with a monkey, and we were told that you could be like a powerful monster hunter. And Blinsky's like, me? No, not me. I can't remember what accent I used for Blinsky, but it was something like that. He was like, no, I got this monkey from Rictavio, and that's when they were like, okay. And then he was like, maybe Rictavio is the person we're looking for. But unfortunately, it was around that time that Rictavio learned that everyone knew about his tiger. So he was panicked then. And he was like, I need to get out of here. And he went with his backup plan where he took his carriage and tiger to Van Richten's tower, Kazan's tower. And they caught him as he was literally riding out of the town. And before he got to the west gates, he was on his way out and they talked to him. And because he was a fated ally, he said, and because he sensed something about the PCs, he said, listen, let's not talk now. No, I should do the Rictavio voice. Listen, let's not talk now. There's a tower to the west of Vallaki. We should go there and discuss this. I've not been entirely truthful about who I am and what I'm doing here in Vallaki and Barovia. When you come to the tower, shout up and I'll come down. And I'm sure there's a few DMs right now who are kind of grimacing at me for saying that, because if you know about the tower, you know that the door and the tower is trapped. Ezmerelda's wagon as well. You can have a lot of fun, evil DM fun with that tower. But the way I rationalize it is Van Richten knows all this. Maybe he doesn't know about the wagon, but he knows about the tower's defenses. He's going to say to them, listen, shout up and I'll come down, as opposed to, just expecting them to try and open the door and this dragon appears and there's lightning everywhere. This is the same as well, I guess, if you had Ezmerelda as the ally. She's traveling the PC. She's not going to let them just figure out the door. She knows how the door works. She's just going to do it, which is a shame, but it's playing them true to who they are. They're intelligent people. They know how these things work. Yeah, I know it's a shame because it meant then they didn't have to activate the door and stuff. They did actually know the door. As soon as they looked at the door, I think they realised what needed to be done. But still, what I actually did was when they went to the tower, they did shout up. And I got them to roll a performance check and it was really low. And then they rolled again and it was high. And if that second roll had been low, I'd just say, nobody hears you. And then they would have had to have gone in the tower anyway. So that's another way to handle it is, do a performance check. Does Van Richten hear them at the top of the tower? He opens the door. Instead of seeing this half-elf bard that they're used to, they see this old human man. And he's like, oh, good, you're here. Come on in, quickly. And they're like, who are you, dude? We're not just going to come in because you've said so. He's like, what are you doing? You're wasting time. And then he goes, forgive me, I forgot. And he puts on a hat, walks out the radius of the tower's anti-magic field and transforms. And he says, it's me, friends, Rictavio. I'll explain when we go inside. And then when he goes back inside, he takes the hat off and transforms back into Van Richten because he can't use his magic there. And they go inside the tower. They go up the lift. And I had him say something like, I'm not being entirely truthful with you folks. I'm not really Rictavio, a carnival ringmaster or half-elf bard. My name is Dr Rudolph van Richten. And I came to Barovia to kill Strahd. And I still remember multiple of my players at the moment just going, whoa. And that was, again, goosebumps just thinking about it. That was one of the best moments in our campaign, hands down. I just loved that moment. That blew their minds. Not just the fact that the reveal and he's actually Rictavio. Rictavio is this actual cool sort of Van Helsing style monster hunter doctor. But just the fact that someone willingly went to Barovia, I think they kind of knew they'd been dragged in to Barovia. They didn't want to be there. Nobody wanted to be there. And this guy willingly chose to go into Barovia to tackle Strahd. And they loved that. And that was amazing. I loved that moment. And they explain the tarokka reading. They explain that he's, he realizes he's the ally and he realizes he's got to travel with them. And he traveled with them and he took his wagon and his tiger everywhere he went, and he treated the tower as the base. And as I mentioned earlier, he did warn them about his curse, but they were okay with that. Actually, the first time they went to leave the tower as well, I played the Ezmerelda's retreat event, I think it's called, where Ezmerelda appears having just gone to Castle Ravenloft to try and take down Strahd and failing. She's a bit woozy, she's taken some damage. She's like, who are you guys and what are you doing in my tower? Because she's the one who's been using the tower in Rictavio's absence. And then, Rictavio / Van Richten reveals himself to her. And she's like, oh my God, it's you. I've been looking for you. She joined them for a bit, but not, she was a drop-in, drop-out kind of NPC, as opposed to somebody who was there all the time, which was handy as well, because having her and Van Richten as allies were, they're both two really good NPCs, and I didn't want the PCs feeling overshadowed or finding things too easy. My players were kind of newish. Some of them were new to D&D. They weren't very combat savvy or necessarily strategic in combat, so having people like Van Richten and at times Ezmerelda helping them was, it probably would have died a few times if they didn't have those guys, to be fair. One cool thing as well is that when they got the Holy Symbol of Ravenkind later, the Wizard PC, who still plays in my game now as the sort of later post-CoS Strahd Ravenloft campaign, wanted to take a multi-class as a cleric. And we kind of flavoured it as he would ask Rictavio Van Richten questions about his spells and about things like that, and that's kind of how, instead of just saying, oh, you're a cleric now, he kind of learned from Van Richten how to become a cleric. And who better to learn from, hey, than, the ultimate vampire monster killing machine. So I had this whole thing, and I talk about this in my homebrew changes video or homebrew additions video, where they had to go back to the village of Barovia to defeat Doru, because Doru escaped. And this was cool as well, because it was kind of their first outing with Rictavio Van Richten, and he was able to kind of help them defeat this vampire spawn. This was before they did the coffin shop as well, where there were like 6 of them, and they had to go back and defeat him, and he was trying his best to kind of help them and guide them, and I threw in a few other minions and monsters as well. It was kind of like set up as like a trap set by Strahd. He took a sample of Doru's clothes with a view to commission another doll from Blinsky as in addition or potentially as a replacement to the Vistani doll he did before. The whole time, anytime that Ezmerelda was with them, there were obviously the players were like, we want to see this tiger, why aren't you bringing out this tiger? And he didn't tell the PCs this, but he didn't want to bring out the tiger anytime Ezmerelda was around in case it attacked Ezmerelda. So he only brought it out once or twice when Ezmerelda wasn't with them. For instance, when they went to the dinner with Strahd, Ezmerelda abstained because, she was like, I don't think he really wants to see me after I, tried to kill him and stuff. So she sat that one out, and then they didn't have any danger on their way to the castle, but on their way back, I added a corpse flower. I talk about this in my alternative random encounters video, and he brought out the tiger for that. And then the tiger had its first debut attacking this corpse flower and the zombies around it and stuff, and that was really good fun. They had the dinner with Strahd, as I mentioned a moment ago. I ran it non-rules as written. In the book, it's kind of set up as like a trap, but a lot of people do it as a kind of a proper dinner, like a diplomatic meeting. Strahd gives them some quests. They might be able to meet Rahadin and the consorts as well. Get a good way to introduce them to Strahd's other minions and lieutenants kind of thing. Well, hilariously, one of the quests that Strahd gave them was, there's a vampire hunter called Van Richten in this land. I want you to find him, tell me where he is, or even kill him for me. And Rictavio sat there the whole time like, oh, yes, Van Richten, huh? That's sly dog. We'll definitely help you find him. And he's like terrified, like hoping that the PCs don't go, oh, you mean this guy over here? That was quite fun and quite amusing, and obviously they didn't do that quest or any of the other quests Strahd gave them, which annoyed Strahd to no end, of course. But we had the moment, sadly, where I rolled on the Svalich Road random encounters table and a group of Vistani walked past the wagon and the tiger escaped and attacked. And then it came to light why the tiger specifically was going after Vistani. Ezmerelda kept her distance from the wagon anyway, and I kind of flavoured it as because she's kind of more of a, I think the terminology is Romanio, she's like a solo Vistani, she's not part of a group, that she maybe the tiger's less interested in her, for lack of a better word. I did have a moment where Aragorn from the camp outside Valachan went near the wagon once and the tiger lurched and Aragorn was like, whoa, what have you got in there? Kind of attitude. But anyway, yes, they kind of connected the dots at that point and realised that Rictavio trained this tiger to attack Vistani. The PCs and the players hated him for that, and they were very uncomfortable. They didn't like that, and they said, well, we're going to turn you into the Vistani. And this was awesome sort of sidebar in our campaign, but I was also like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? So to buy myself some time, and I thought it worked better, they took him to Aragorn and Luvash's camp, and they said, the Vistani that were killed are not ours, they're actually from Madam Eva's camp. And then they kind of escorted Van Richten, and the players went with them, PCs went with them. They all travelled as a collective. Not all of the Vistani from the Valachan camp, but like Aragorn, Luvash, and a couple of others, escorted them all to Madam Eva's camp, and they went back to Serpool encampment. It's a great way to reintroduce Madam Eva, because Madam Eva's almost like a one and done NPC. They see her, have the card reading, she may never even be seen again. So it was great to kind of introduce her another time, and the players, PCs, get to know her a bit more. I talk about this in more detail in the homebrew additions changes video I did, but ultimately he was found not guilty due to insufficient evidence. Even though they knew about the Vistana doll, they withheld it. They were told that the tiger was going to be sent to Markovia, because I read in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft that the island of Markovia, the animals there are sapient. So instead of putting down the tiger or something else, they were going to take it there, and then it was going to be given sapience and intelligence, and hopefully being a sapience intelligent creature, it would kind of make it realise, hunting Vistani is bad kind of thing. And we had a lot of fun with that later, because after finishing Curse of Strahd and leaving Barovia, they actually found the tiger again, thanks to the Doru clothing doll that Belinsky did. In addition to, it got to the point where instead of hunting Vistani, he wanted it was a lady tiger, wanted to hunt undead. And then they took it to Folkovnia, where there's constant zombie sieges, and it was like the perfect fit. Having this wise, intelligent, talking, armoured saber-toothed tiger who wants to kill zombies to a land full of zombies. It was so much fun. And I'm digressing now, sorry. I'm going to sort of gloss over some of this stuff. So they visited, once he was their fated ally, they visited lots of places. I think they went to Krezk, the werewolf den, Argynvostholt, the old bone grinder, with Rictavio in tow. And he was able to help them, give advice, heal them, and so on. But then, my players were completionists. Despite getting all the tarokka stuff, they still wanted to do things like Berez and the Amber Temple. And they're in the middle of Argynvostholt when two of my players told me they had to move away. And even though we play online, they were moving to somewhere they were worried. We all live in the UK, but they were moving to a remote part of Canada, where they were told they may not even have a reliable internet connection. So I was like, oh boy, I'm losing 2 of my 5 players. So we decided to wrap things up. And the way I did this was when we returned to Valaki after doing Argynvostholt, Rictavio and Ezmerelda left the party for a bit, and then Ezmerelda rejoins them and says, Strahd appeared. He's taken Rictavio. So Rictavio / Van Richten got captured, which I know is quite an unfair thing to do because he's the fated ally. But I also thought they got Ezmerelda, and they were talking about trying to rope in 1 or 2 other NPC allies to join them in the end game, to join them in Castle Ravenloft. So Ezmerelda was almost like a temporary replacement fated ally. At that point, Ezmerelda wasn't going to leave their side, at least until they got Van Richten back, so they weren't completely shortchanged. At that point, they went to Castle Ravenloft. They had a few objectives, obviously kill Strahd. They wanted to find his coffin in case he retreated there. And one of their objectives was find Van Richten and save him. And they found him in the dungeons alongside, I think his name is Emil, the werewolf there. He was in a different cell, and they rescued him. They found his stuff that Cyrus Bellevue, I think on the floor above, had been holding on to. He said at that point as well, he was like, well, I guess I don't need this hat of disguise anymore. And he dropped the Rictavio persona then and was just full on Van Richten through the castle. And I got to use his regular token, his regular look. At the final battle against Strahd, which was epic, multiple sessions, albeit our sessions are a bit shorter than most people's, I think about 2.5 hours, and 18 rounds it was in the end, which I know sounds excessive, but yeah, it was good fun. I think I always have the habit of having really short combats, so it's nice to have one really long one where the players pretty much expended every single resource, and Strahd, just before he'd been defeated, had expended almost all of his spell slots, and it was really close in the end. And we didn't have any PC deaths in the final battle or even in the campaign, but had a few instances of a few people who were on 2 out of 3 failed death saves, and very close multiple times with multiple people. It was quite scary. And that was it. They finished Curse of Strahd, they defeated Strahd, they could leave Barovia, and I played Van Richten's leaving Barovia very true to the epilogue. The epilogue kind of says he just leaves. And if he wasn't a fated ally, that's probably how I would have played it. But because he was their fated ally, I thought it'd be a bit weird if he just left without saying goodbye. So he said goodbye to them. He said, if you ever need me again, seek me out in my shop in a domain called Mordant. Ezmerelda, as per the epilogue, said she was going to stay in Barovia. And then we ran a post-Curse of Strahd domain hopping campaign, starting with Markovia to recruit the saber-toothed tiger, and Folkovnia, because one of the PCs that joined the mid-campaign was from Folkovnia, He wanted to return home, and similar to Barovia, wanted to free his people and try and stop the zombie sieges. Now, when they were in Volkovnia, they had a second tarokka reading. This is a DM's Guild resource I put out where it's similar to Madam Eva's. The players are ushered towards magic items and a fated ally spread, this time throughout all the domains of Dread, not just Barovia. And the ally, they were told, was a druidic twin, and they didn't know who that would be. But when they spoke to their friend who's knowledgeable about the domains of Dread, Ezmerelda Davenier, who's one time when they went back to Barovia, she said, well, that sounds like one of the weathermay-foxgrove twins, Jennifer and Laurie. Jennifer is a druid in training, so maybe it's her. So they decide to go to Van Richten's shop in Mordant, and they were like, we'll see Van Richten again. So they go to Mordant, find the weathermay-foxgrove twins, and they say, no, we haven't seen him. We've not seen him for months. Last time we saw him was before he went to Barovia. Uh-oh. Something's clearly happened, because he told the PCs that he was heading straight from Barovia to Mordant. So something happened on the way. They were trying to figure out and wondering where he'd gone when I think it was their second visit to the carnival. They met a family there who were sort of refugees from Darkon. And because of the whole business of Darkon, this is all detailed in Van Richten's guide, the Darklord disappeared, and then there's 3 people who are trying to be his replacement. The mist borders are open, so people are trying to escape Darkon. This family escaped Darkon, but instead of ending up in a nice peaceful domain, they ended up in Valachan, of all places, the deadly jungle, similar to like Hunger Games type tournaments and competitions. They appeared in there, but they were rescued by someone who selflessly not only got them to safety, but then decided to stay in Valachan to save people. And I played it that the mum was pregnant, and they said that in honor of this man who saved their lives, whether it was a boy or a girl, they're going to name their child Rudy. And as soon as I said Rudy, one of my players said, the person who saved you wasn't called Rudolph, was he? They were like, yeah, Rudolph, Dr Rudolph van Richten. And they were like, oh, he's in Valachan. And one thing that obviously piqued their interest was he could escape. The mist borders were open. Van Richten could have left with his Darkon family, but for some reason he decided to stay. So that was very interesting. They were like, well, we know if we go to Valachan, hopefully we'll see him there. Then they went to Valachan much later on. I talk about this in the How I Ran Valachan video I did, which I think is still my longest video to date. It's about 1 hour and 20 minutes. I cover the whole of Valachan, how they got there, everything before, during and after the Trial of Hearts, the kinds of monsters I included, how I roleplayed the Darklord and the previous Darklord, things like that. It's a long video, but if you ever plan to run Valachan, hopefully it's useful to you. And they found him at one of the 2 villages, the village of Orsello. The story was he got waylaid by the mists. He was leaving Barovia and got waylaid into Valachan. And then he discovered Chikuna's nature, and instead of leaving Valachan, he decided to stay. He was fascinated by the fact that Chikuna can't be killed in a traditional way. I played it that at one point he actually sees her get killed, and then she comes back to life, and he's like, huh, there's more to this Darklord than just simply killing her. She keeps returning, or can't be killed easily, and there's a whole business. If you know about Valachan and the information in Van Richten's guide, there's a special ritual that has to be done in order to defeat her. When they saw him as well, they were traveling around with him, and there were a few times I said that something was attacking a monster and doing force damage. And they were like, what? But it was something that was helping them. Something that wouldn't attack them, it would just attack monsters they were fighting. And then one of my players has see invisibility and cast see invisibility. And at one point I described seeing this sort of ghostly form of this teenager who panicked then, looking, because he realised he'd been sort of spotted by the PCs and was doing this and pointing to Van Richten doing that. And it turns out that this is Erasmus Van Richten. Van Richten's guide suggests a ghost, but I chose the poltergeist stat block because this poltergeist as standard is invisible. I played it as well that, I think it says in Van Richten's guide that if Van Richten's told you've got a ghostly boy following you as a ghost, then Van Richten just waves it off and is like, nah, it's just tricks from the dark powers, it's not actually him, I'm just being tormented. And yeah, so they had Erasmus Van Richten for them during Valachan as well. They did the Trial of Hearts. I ran out of Ravenloft Mist Hunters, which is the Adventurers League stuff, and it worked really well. After the Trial of Hearts, they found Ulrich von Karkov, the previous Darklord, and helped him get his body back, because in Van Richten's guide, he's just a head. They went to Castle Pantara, which isn't in 5th edition, but is in older modules, and I even made a map for it using Dungeon Draft. And then later they went to Jaguar's Heart, the sort of temple where the ritual is done, and they battled Chikuna, because she obviously tried to stop them before they can figure out how to defeat her. And then Ulrich tells them the ritual. One of them has to sacrifice themselves. You can't truly defeat the Darklord of Valachan. Someone has got to replace them. Otherwise Valachan will be destroyed. They've got to make sure that the jungle always gets blood and people always die. That's how you feed Valachan, and that's how Valachan doesn't destroy itself. Van Richten had a plan. He's an old man anyway. He thought he'd die taking down Strahd. He never thought he'd make it as far as taking down Chacuna as well. He says to the players, I'll become the next Darklord. I'll buy you as much time as possible. You escape Valachan. You evacuate the villagers. Evacuate as many people as you can. And then I will destroy Valachan. All that'll be left in Valachan at that point will just be monsters anyway. I will destroy Valachan and take myself and Valachan out together. There were a few tearful goodbyes, not just Jennifer weathermay-foxgrove. The weathermay-foxgrove twins of protégés like Ezmerelda of Van Richten. They also considered him like an honorary uncle. They call him Uncle Rudolph. But there was also Erasmus as well. And one of my players rolled a high enough persuasion check that they convinced Van Richten that this wasn't a trick of the Dark Powers. His teenage son was there. And Van Richten said to Erasmus, I'm sorry, son. I'm sorry about being a terrible father to you, to letting you down, to letting you get killed. Please travel with these people. They'll look after you better than I did. And yeah, it was a great moment. And they left Valachan. They evacuated the villages. And literally as their ship sailed through the borders, the mist borders, and out of Valachan, the whole of Valachan just collapsed in on itself. And that was the death of Dr. Rudolph van Richten. Or was it? Because I later remembered that he had a ring of mind shielding. I remembered when somebody dies while wearing a ring of mind shielding, their soul goes into the ring. Now suppose somebody's wandering through the mists where Valachan once appeared and just finds a ring in the mists. And I had an idea where maybe a Vistani finds it. Maybe the Vistani that's tied to the whole prophecy, the person who gave them the second tarokka reading, tied to the whole campaign, he finds it and sends it to them as a letter. And I had this whole idea of maybe Ezmerelda's like, oh, it's just a ring, puts it on her finger, screams, starts weeping uncontrollably, takes the ring off her finger, offers to put it on a PC's finger, and then when a PC puts it on their finger, they hear a familiar voice say, hello, PC's name, it's me. And quite fittingly, as I'm recording this, we've got a session tonight. It'll probably be our last session in the Domain of Dread called Forlorn. And in Castles Forlorn, the old module, there is actually a Rod of Resurrection as treasure. And they found it. And they have a Rod of Resurrection. They could potentially bring Van Richten back from the dead through the fact that they've got this ring. But then, you know, I posted about this on Reddit and told people my ideas, and a few people kind of like, this is Ravenloft. It shouldn't be this easy or this useful for the players just coincidentally come across this ring. What if a Darklord or an enemy of Van Richten got hold of this ring? You know, there's so much fun I can have with this, and I'm still weighing up what to do. And I guess we'll see in the future. One thing I wanted to cover off briefly as well, as I appreciate that everything that kind of happens, this is, I guess, even though this is a Curse of Strahd and a Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft video, kind of covers both, it's been very much talking about how to running in Curse of Strahd and things like that. And I appreciate there might be some people who want to write a wider Ravenloft campaign in 5th edition and want to use Van Richten, but they may not want to run Curse of Strahd. Maybe they don't want to include Barovia, maybe they don't want to include Strahd. So I'm going to end off quickly with a few ideas of how you can kind of incorporate him into a non-Curse of Strahd game. Van Richten's Guide has some tips. Obviously, a few ideas, adventure ideas in the Mist Wanderer section. Maybe he's found in a shop in Mordant. Maybe instead of me, where he never made it to a shop in Mordant, he was in Valachan instead. Maybe he is actually there and they meet him there. Maybe something related to his past. He's from this town or village of Rivelis, I think it's pronounced, in Darkon. Maybe something happens, he's found in Darkon, or they've got to go to Darkon, and either he tasks the PCs with going with him, maybe they find out for someone else he's got to be rescued. Maybe something to do with the ghosts of Erasmus, or I think it's Ingrid, his wife's name. Maybe something to do with that. Anyone such as Ezmerelda, the weathermay-foxgrove twins, or Alan Gray, Arthur Sedgwick, any of his protégés have a tie in a relationship to him. Maybe one of them says, you know, we haven't seen Van Richten, or maybe you'll find Van Richten in this place, why didn't you go? Maybe he's captured by Alcio from the Karjat, the Darkon secret police. Alcio Metis is detailed in Van Richten's Guide. She is the sister of Baron Metis, who was the vampire who killed and turned Van Richten's son Erasmus, and who was also the first vampire Rudolph van Richten killed. Maybe it's something to do with that. I didn't mention this earlier, but when they first went to the shop in Mordant, Alcio and a few vampire spawn and a few werewolves, they were led by Natalia, who is also from the Old Law, I think mentioned in Van Richten's Guide. They all attacked Van Richten's shop. And so my players know of Alcio, and I don't really necessarily know why she hates his guts and wants to, you know, defeat Van Richten. You don't know the fact that Van Richten's responsible for the death. Oh no, I think weathermay-foxgrove twins might have told them actually. But anyway, you could tie that in as well. And if you want, I feel like I'm coming full circle because I mentioned this really on in the video, but that Foes of Van Richten section category in Misterpedia, mine that for information and ideas. There's loads of potential ideas of he defeated this thing in Mordia, he went to this place in Darkon, he went to this place in Markovia, he went to this place in insert domain name here. I'm sure that'll give you loads of ideas of stuff. Maybe it's an enemy he once defeated, but they weren't truly defeated and they came back, or something like that. And that's it for this one. Upcoming videos, I still want to tackle all the other Curse of Strahd, Fated Allies, Strahd's enemies. I was going to do it in one video, but there's 20 of them. I think I'll do 2 parts, do 10 in one video, 10 in another. They will likely probably be my next Curse of Strahd video, so keep an eye out for them. On the Ravenloft front, as I record this, we're just about to finish Forlorn. So I'll finally do my part 2 Forlorn video. My part 1 was like everything up to the castle for the end game. And then part 2 is going to be just the castle, because the castle is quite complicated. It's big, but it's also got, there's time shifting shenanigans going on. So they might go to a room and then see it in the past, and then go to it later and see it in present day, and so on. So I'll talk all about that in that video. And I've had an opportunity to take them to Tovag, which is the domain of dread of Kaz the Bloody-Handed, Kaz the Destroyer, Kaz the Betrayer, Vecna's rival. So that's probably only going to be a few sessions thing. So chances are I'll do that really quickly, do a video not long after the Forlorn Part 2 one, and then I'll tackle that one as well. And I have plans in the future to do Hazlan and the Shadowlands, but they're probably going to be a few months away yet until I do those videos, because I like to do the videos after I've finished somewhere. I've finished running it in my home game, my own game. And so if you want to see those, well, I'll do the classic YouTube thing and say, please subscribe, and then you'll see them in the future. And we'll leave it there. Thank you, Miss Wanderers. Richten, 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 Richten. That sounds like a really terrible dance song. Richten, 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 blah 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 blah. Richten, 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 boo. This is stupid. I'm gonna just stop the video now.